I found something in a newspaper archive last year that I still cannot explain. It was an article from 1812 describing the excavation of a skeleton in Ohio. The remains measured over 9 feet tall. The skull had a double row of teeth. According to the report, such discoveries were remarkably common back then. Dozens of similar accounts from that era describe giant bones unearthed across America and Europe. But here is what stopped me. After 1817, these discoveries suddenly ended. Not gradually, abruptly, as if someone flipped a switch, and yet nobody seems to want to talk about why. The official story is simple. Giants are myths. They belong to fairy tales and ancient legends, stories told by primitive people who did not understand the world around them. We are taught that human beings have always been roughly the same size, give or take a few inches, depending on nutrition and genetics. The idea of a race of giants walking the earth is dismissed as fantasy, the product of overactive imaginations and misinterpreted fossils. But when you actually look at the historical record, when you examine the newspaper accounts and excavation reports from the 1800s, that story starts to fall apart. I spent months going through digitized archives, searching for something I had heard whispered about in obscure corners of the internet. What I found exceeded anything I had expected. Account after account, newspaper after newspaper, describing the discovery of giant human remains across America. These were not tabloid stories or sensationalized fiction. They were straightforward news reports, written in the matter-of-fact tone of local journalism, describing excavations that unearthed skeletons measuring 8 feet, 9 feet, sometimes over 10 feet tall. The measurements were precise. A skeleton discovered in Licking County, Ohio in 1829 measured 9 feet 2 inches. Another found in West Virginia in 1884 stood at 7 feet 8 inches, with a skull nearly twice the circumference of a normal human head. Reports from Wisconsin described burial mounds containing remains of beings over 8 feet tall, their bones so large that witnesses initially mistook them for animal remains. The femurs were too long, the skulls were too broad. The jaw structures showed double rows of teeth, a feature that appeared in account after account across different states and different decades. Think about it. These were not isolated incidents. I found over 200 newspaper accounts from the 1800s describing giant skeletal discoveries in America alone. Ohio, Tennessee, New York, Minnesota, California, Pennsylvania. The reports came from credible sources. Local newspapers, scientific journals, letters from doctors and surveyors who examined the remains firsthand. They described what they saw in clinical detail. Elongated skulls, massive bone density, anatomical proportions that did not match any known human population. The pattern was unmistakable. Something different had lived here, something larger than us. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. In almost every account I found, the remains were collected by institutions. Museums sent representatives. Universities dispatched researchers. The Smithsonian Institution appears in report after report, arriving to claim the bones for further study. And then the remains vanished. Not destroyed, supposedly. Just never seen again. Never displayed, never published in scientific literature, never mentioned in the official archaeological record. I tried to trace what happened to specific discoveries. The 9-foot skeleton from Licking County was reportedly sent to a museum in the East. No record of its arrival exists. Giant remains found in a burial mound near Chillicothe were collected by a team from Washington. The bones never appeared in any catalog. A massive skull with double rows of teeth, discovered by farmers in Minnesota, was purchased by a private collector acting on behalf of an unnamed institution. It has never surfaced since. The disappearances were systematic. Every major discovery followed the same trajectory. Local excitement, institutional collection, permanent silence. The bones entered the system and never came out. We are told this is normal. Remains get lost. Records get misplaced. The chaos of 19th century record-keeping explains the gaps. But when you see the same pattern repeated dozens of times, when you realize that not a single giant skeleton from this era exists in any public collection anywhere in the world, the explanation begins to feel insufficient. We are not talking about a few lost specimens. We are talking about the complete erasure of an entire category of evidence. And then there is 1817. I noticed the date appearing again and again as I worked through the archives. Before 1817, accounts of giant discoveries were remarkably common. Newspapers reported them without apparent skepticism. Scientists discussed them as curiosities worthy of investigation. The existence of unusually large human remains was treated as an established fact, something everyone knew about, even if no one fully understood it. After 1817, the tone changed. Discoveries became rarer. Reports became shorter, more dismissive. By the 1830s and 1840s, newspapers were already describing giant finds as probable hoaxes or misidentified animal bones. The shift was dramatic and sudden. Something had changed in how these discoveries were perceived, discussed, and handled. I started looking for what happened in 1817 specifically. The historical record from that period is chaotic. The year without a summer had just passed in 1816, bringing crop failures and famine across the northern hemisphere. Volcanic ash from Tambora darkened skies worldwide. Strange weather patterns disrupted everything, and in the midst of this chaos, the giants stopped being found. Not entirely. Scattered reports continued for decades, but the frequency dropped sharply. The institutional response changed from collection to dismissal. And the window of openness, that brief period when newspapers could report giant discoveries without ridicule, closed permanently. The timing cannot be coincidental. Something happened in 1817 that changed everything. Something that made the evidence disappear and the narrative shift. Something that ensured we would grow up believing giants were nothing but myths. I found a letter from 1823, written by a surveyor working in the Ohio Valley. He described encountering an elderly native man who spoke of the Tall Ones, a race of giants who had ruled the land before the Great Darkness came. The surveyor asked what had happened to them. The old man said they were taken, all of them, in the time of ash and cold. When the surveyor pressed for details, the man refused to say more. He seemed afraid. The letter was dismissed as folklore at the time, but it matches too many other accounts I found. Stories from indigenous peoples across America describing a race of giants who vanished suddenly. European legends of the old ones who were swept away. Chinese records of tall kings who disappeared during a period of darkness and flood. The same story, told independently across cultures that had no contact with each other. We are told these are just myths, universal archetypes that appear in every culture because humans like to imagine things larger than themselves. But what if they are memories? What if cultures around the world remember the giants because the giants were real? And what if 1817 marks not the beginning of a myth, but the end of a bloodline? The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. Hundreds of newspaper accounts, dozens of excavation reports, photographs from the 1860s and 1870s showing skeletons that dwarf the men standing beside them. And a consistent pattern of institutional collection followed by permanent disappearance. Something lived here that we have been taught to forget. Something happened to them that we are not supposed to know. and the year 1817 sits at the center of it all. A pivot point between the world that remembered and the world that was made to forget. The more I researched, the more I realized that America was not unique. The same evidence exists across the entire world. Giant skeletal remains discovered in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, South America. Newspaper accounts from London describing excavations that unearthed bones of enormous size. Russian scientific journals from the 1800s documenting the discovery of oversized human remains in Siberia. Reports from explorers in South America finding burial sites containing skeletons far larger than any indigenous population. The pattern was global. Whatever lived here, whatever vanished, it was not confined to one continent. I found accounts from Ireland describing giant bones discovered in peat bogs during the 1700s. Reports from France documenting enormous skeletal remains unearthed during construction projects. German scientific papers discussing the anatomical peculiarities of oversized human fossils. The measurements varied, but they clustered in the same range. 8 feet, 9 feet, occasionally larger. Skulls with unusual cranial capacity, bone density that exceeded normal human parameters, and in every case, the same pattern of institutional collection followed by silence. The official explanation is that these were all hoaxes or misidentifications. Mammoth bones mistaken for giant humans. Elaborate frauds perpetrated by showmen seeking publicity. Exaggerated accounts from credulous witnesses who did not understand what they were seeing. We are told that the scientific community debunked these claims long ago, that serious researchers have moved on to more legitimate inquiries. But when you actually examine the accounts, the hoax explanation falls apart. Many of these discoveries were made by trained professionals. Doctors measured the bones and documented their findings. Surveyors with no motive to deceive recorded what they unearthed. University professors examined specimens and wrote detailed anatomical descriptions. These were not carnival barkers looking to sell tickets. They were serious people encountering something that did not fit their understanding of human history. And here is where it gets interesting. The giants were not random mutations scattered across populations. The evidence suggests they were a distinct lineage, a bloodline that ruled before the current age of humanity. Look at the locations where giant remains were consistently found. They cluster around sites of ancient power, burial mounds built with sophisticated engineering, megalithic structures that supposedly primitive peoples could not have constructed. The giants were not outcasts or anomalies. They were the builders, the rulers, the ones who shaped the world we inherited. Think about the architecture that survives from the ancient world. Doorways 15 feet tall in structures we are told were built by people our size. Chairs carved from stone that would seat someone twice our height. Staircases with steps so tall they require effort to climb. We are told these proportions were symbolic, designed to inspire awe rather than accommodate actual inhabitants. But what if we have it backwards? What if the buildings were built to scale, and we simply cannot accept who they were built for? I started examining photographs of ancient structures more carefully. Cathedrals with doors that dwarf the priests who enter them. Palaces with ceilings that seem absurdly high for any practical purpose. Thrones sized for beings far larger than any modern royal. The Tartarian architecture that supposedly never existed shows consistent proportions. Everything is built bigger than it needs to be, unless it was built for someone bigger than us. The Tartarian Empire appears in old maps. You can find references to it in encyclopedias from the 1700s and early 1800s. A vast civilization spanning most of Asia and extending into Europe and North America. We are told it was a cartographic error, a vague designation for unexplored territories. But the maps show cities. They show roads. They show an infrastructure network that connected continents. And then, sometime in the early 1800s, Tartaria vanished from the maps entirely, erased as thoroughly as the giant bones were erased from museum collections. What if Tartaria was not a geographic designation, but a civilizational one? What if it referred to the empire of the Tall Ones, the giants who built the impossible architecture and ruled before the catastrophe? The timeline matches. Tartaria disappears from maps around the same time giant discoveries stop being reported openly. The same decades, the same sudden erasure. I found descriptions of Tartarian people in travel accounts from the 1600s and 1700s. Explorers described encountering inhabitants of unusual height and distinctive features. They wrote about cities with architecture unlike anything in Europe, buildings of enormous scale and sophisticated design. These accounts were treated as credible at the time. They appeared in respected publications. And then they were forgotten, dismissed as fantasy or exaggeration by later historians who could not reconcile them with the official narrative. The pieces fit together in ways that should not be coincidental. A global civilization of giants who built megalithic structures and ruled vast territories. Evidence of their existence documented across continents and centuries. A sudden disappearance concentrated around 1817, coinciding with catastrophic geological events, and a systematic effort to erase their memory, collecting their bones, demolishing their buildings, rewriting the maps to remove any trace of their empire. We are told that empires fall gradually. They decline over centuries through corruption, invasion, economic collapse. But what if some empires do not fall? What if they are ended, deliberately, completely, with such thoroughness that even their bones vanish from the record? I started looking at the 1816 to 1817 period differently. The year without a summer was not just a climate event. It was accompanied by reports of strange phenomena worldwide. Unusual darkness that persisted for months, crop failures that decimated populations, mass migrations as people fled devastated regions. And in the chaos, something else was happening. Something that accounts from the period hint at, but never fully describe. There are references in obscure documents to conflicts during this period that do not appear in official histories. Mentions of campaigns against remaining strongholds of the old order. Descriptions of systematic destruction of certain populations. The language is vague, coded, as if the writers knew they were documenting something they were not supposed to record. But the implication is clear. The giants did not simply die out. They were eliminated. Who would have the capacity to end an entire bloodline? Who would have the motive? The giants, if they existed as rulers, would have been obstacles to any new order seeking to establish itself. Their knowledge, their technology, their claim to authority based on lineage and capability. All of it would need to be erased for a new civilization to rise in their place. And the chaos of 1816 to 1817, the volcanic darkness and famine and social collapse, would have provided perfect cover for such an operation. This was not natural extinction. This was not gradual decline. The evidence points to something far more deliberate. A coordinated effort to eliminate the giant bloodline while the world was distracted by catastrophe. A cleansing disguised as natural disaster. And then a systematic campaign to erase any memory of what had been destroyed, collecting the bones, rewriting the histories, ensuring that within a few generations, the giants would become nothing but myths. The infrastructure they built still stands. The doorways are still too tall. The architecture still does not match the humans who supposedly constructed it. And somewhere, in archives and private collections. The evidence of their existence remains hidden. Bones that would rewrite human history, records that would reveal what really happened in 1817, proof that we are living in the aftermath of an extermination so complete that we have forgotten it ever occurred. I found something in a London archive that made my blood run cold. It was a report from 1819, written by an engineer working on excavations beneath St. Petersburg. He described discovering chambers deep underground, rooms that had been sealed and buried beneath meters of sediment. The chambers contained remains, skeletal remains of beings he estimated at over 9 feet tall. But that was not what disturbed him most. The remains showed signs of violence, skulls fractured, bones broken. These giants had not died peacefully. They had been killed. The engineer's report was never published. I found it in a collection of private correspondence that had been donated to the archive decades later. He wrote that his superiors ordered him to seal the chambers without documenting what he found. The bones were removed by men he did not recognize. He was told to forget what he had seen. The report ends with a single haunting line. "They are erasing them," he wrote. "All of them. As if they never existed." St. Petersburg itself is an anomaly that historians struggle to explain. We are told Peter the Great built the city from scratch in 1703, constructing an entire metropolis in a swamp through sheer force of will. The official history describes thousands of workers dying to create something from nothing. But the architecture tells a different story. Buildings with foundations that go down far deeper than they should. Structures designed for inhabitants larger than any Russian peasant. And beneath the modern street level, buried chambers and passages that predate the official founding by centuries. I found similar accounts from Prague. Workers excavating near the Charles Bridge in 1847 discovered underground rooms containing oversized furniture and skeletal remains of unusual dimensions. The discovery was reported in a local newspaper, then never mentioned again. The remains were collected by representatives from Vienna. No record of their arrival exists in any Austrian archive I could access. The pattern repeats. Discovery, collection, silence. The American mound sites tell the same story with even greater clarity. The great mounds of Ohio, Wisconsin, and the Mississippi Valley were systematically excavated during the 1800s. Account after account describes the discovery of giant skeletal remains within burial chambers of sophisticated construction. The mounds themselves required engineering knowledge that supposedly did not exist in pre-Columbian America. Precise geometric alignments, complex internal structures, earthworks covering hundreds of acres. We are told primitive natives built them with hand tools and baskets of dirt. But the giants buried inside suggest a different explanation. Think about what it would take to construct the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. Over 1,300 feet of precisely aligned earthwork. Mathematically proportioned to astronomical alignments that require advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics. We are told people without written language or metal tools accomplish this. But the skeletal remains found in similar mounds throughout the region suggest the builders were not like us at all. They were larger. They were different. And they possessed knowledge we have been taught to believe did not exist. The construction impossibilities extend to megalithic sites worldwide. Baalbek in Lebanon contains stones weighing over 1,000 tons, precisely cut and fitted into foundations. The official explanation involves wooden rollers and human labor. But the math does not work. Moving a 1,000-ton stone requires forces that human muscles cannot generate, regardless of how many workers you employ. The same problem appears at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where stones weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with tolerances measured in millimeters. At Puma Punku in Bolivia, where H-shaped blocks of precise geometry suggest machine manufacturing. At the Great Pyramid, where 2.3 million blocks averaging 2.5 tons each were supposedly placed by copper tools and ramps. These structures were not built by people our size using the technology we are told they had. The labor requirements are impossible. The precision is impossible. The logistics are impossible, unless the builders were stronger than us, unless they possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded our own, unless the giants were real, and they built the infrastructure we have inherited. The 1816 to 1817 window becomes more significant the deeper you look. The year without a summer was not an isolated climate event. It was accompanied by geological chaos worldwide. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions across multiple continents simultaneously. The official explanation blames Mount Tambora alone. But the scale of disruption suggests something larger, something that destabilized the entire planet. And in the midst of this chaos, the giants vanished. I found references in Russian documents to military campaigns during 1816 and 1817 that do not appear in any official history. Descriptions of operations against populations in remote regions. Reports of systematic destruction of certain settlements. The language is bureaucratic and vague, but the implications are clear. While the world was distracted by darkness and famine, something was being eliminated. Someone was being eliminated. The mechanism becomes clearer when you consider how an entire bloodline could be ended. The volcanic darkness would have disrupted food production for the giants, just as it did for everyone else. Larger bodies require more calories. A prolonged famine would weaken them disproportionately, and in their weakened state, they would have been vulnerable to coordinated attack by smaller, more numerous adversaries. The catastrophe was not the cause of their extinction. It was the opportunity. Institutional coordination of the erasure began almost immediately. By the 1820s, networks were in place to collect and disappear giant remains whenever they were discovered. Museums, universities, and government agencies worked in concert. Bones were gathered and never displayed. Records were altered or destroyed. Scientists who asked inconvenient questions found their careers ended. Within 2 generations, the existence of giants had been transformed from documented fact to discredited myth. I found one final account that I cannot stop thinking about. It was written in 1821 by a priest in the Ural Mountains. He described ministering to what he called the last of the tall ones, a small community of giants who had survived the darkness by hiding in remote caves. They were dying, he wrote, weakened by years of starvation and hunted by forces they would not name. The priest recorded their stories. They spoke of a great civilization that had spanned the world. They spoke of knowledge that would be lost forever. They spoke of enemies who had waited generations for the opportunity to destroy them. The priest asked who these enemies were. The giants would not say. They seemed afraid, even in their final days. But one of them, an elder whose age the priest could not estimate, told him something that still echoes through time. "They want what we have," he said. "They cannot build it themselves. So they will take our works and claim them as their own, and they will make certain no one remembers we ever existed." The priest's account was discovered in a monastery archive in 1923. The Soviet authorities who found it classified it immediately. I located a reference to its existence in a defector's memoir from the 1970s. The document itself has never been made public, but the description matches too many other accounts to be coincidental. Records of the last giants. testimony from the final survivors of an exterminated bloodline. Evidence that what happened in 1817 was not natural disaster, but deliberate genocide. The implications of what I have uncovered are staggering. If an entire race of giants existed, built the impossible structures we attribute to primitive peoples, ruled a global civilization, and were systematically exterminated within historical memory, then everything we think we know about human progress is wrong. The narrative of steady advancement from caves to cities, from primitive tools to modern technology, the story of civilization slowly building over millennia through human ingenuity and effort. It is all called into question because we did not build from nothing. We inherited from those who came before. Maybe we are not advancing. Maybe we are recovering. Maybe every technological breakthrough and architectural achievement of the past 2 centuries has been humanity slowly rediscovering what the giants already knew. The Industrial Revolution did not emerge from nowhere. It appeared suddenly, explosively, in the decades immediately following 1817. Steam engines, railways, telegraph systems, technologies that transformed the world within a single generation. We are told this was natural progress, the inevitable result of human innovation. But what if it was recovery? What if we were rebuilding capabilities that had just been lost? The Renaissance itself takes on new meaning in this context. We call it a rebirth of classical knowledge, a rediscovery of ancient wisdom after the Dark Ages. But what if the knowledge being recovered was not from Greece and Rome? What if scholars in the 1400s and 1500s were accessing fragments of giant civilization, manuscripts and techniques that had survived the earlier catastrophes? What if the sudden explosion of art, science, and architecture during that period reflected not human genius, but human salvage? I started looking at the power structures that emerged after 1817, the families and institutions that rose to prominence in the 19th century, the banking dynasties, the industrial empires, the academic institutions that became gatekeepers of acceptable knowledge. They appeared almost overnight, establishing control over economies and information systems with remarkable speed, as if they were filling a vacuum, as if something that had previously occupied that space had suddenly been removed. The suppression makes sense when you consider what would happen if the truth became widely known. If people understood that an advanced civilization had been deliberately destroyed, that their bones had been collected and hidden, that history had been rewritten to erase their memory, it would undermine every institution built on the lie. Governments that claim ancient legitimacy would be exposed as recent constructions. Academic authorities who dismissed giant evidence as hoax would be revealed as participants in a cover-up. The entire foundation of modern society would crack. And there is something darker still. If it happened once, it could happen again. If an advanced civilization can be wiped out and forgotten within a few generations, what protects our own? The same forces that eliminated the giants presumably still exist. The same techniques of coordinated destruction and systematic erasure could be deployed again. Perhaps the greatest motivation for suppressing this history is not protecting the powerful, but preventing the rest of us from understanding how vulnerable we truly are. The evidence continues to surface despite the suppression. Even today, giant skeletal remains are occasionally discovered. Construction projects unearth bones that do not fit human parameters. Farmers plowing fields turn up skulls of unusual size. And in every case, the same pattern repeats. Authorities arrive quickly. Remains are collected for study, and nothing is ever heard again. The collection networks established in the 1820s still operate. The bones still disappear. I found a report from 2007 describing a construction crew in Greece that unearthed skeletal remains estimated at over 8 feet tall. Local newspapers covered the discovery for a single day. Then the story vanished. The bones were taken by representatives from a museum that refused to comment. No further information has ever been released. The same scenario has played out in Turkey, in Iran, in Peru, in dozens of locations where giant remains have been found and immediately suppressed. The Smithsonian Institution has been sued multiple times by researchers seeking access to giant skeletal remains supposedly in their collection. Every lawsuit has been dismissed. Every freedom of information request has been denied. The institution maintains that no such remains exist, that all reports of giant bones in their possession are misunderstandings or fabrications. And yet their own records from the 1800s document the collection of exactly such specimens. The bones entered the system. They never came out. And the institution responsible for their care claims they never existed at all. We are told to trust the authorities. We are told that experts know best, that institutions preserve and protect our shared heritage, that history is taught in schools represents the best understanding of our past. But the evidence tells a different story. The authorities collected the bones and made them disappear. The experts dismissed credible accounts as hoax without investigation. The institutions coordinated a cover-up that has lasted 2 centuries. And history as taught in schools is the product of that cover-up, carefully constructed to ensure we never ask the questions that would reveal the truth. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The doorways that are too tall, the architecture designed for larger inhabitants, the megalithic structures that human labor could not have built, the newspaper accounts describing discoveries that official history denies, the pattern of collection and suppression that continues to this day. The giants are everywhere once you know what to look for. Their works surround us. Their bones lie hidden in museum basements and private collections. Their memory persists in myths and legends that we are taught to dismiss as fantasy. I think about them sometimes. The last of the tall ones, dying in caves in the Ural Mountains while the world that destroyed them rebuilt itself on their ruins. The elder who told the priest that their enemies would take their works and claim them as their own, he was right. We walk through their cities and call them ours. We marvel at their architecture and credit ourselves with its construction. We have inherited everything they built and erased every trace of who they were. The giants are still there. Their bones wait beneath the streets of cities they founded. Their chambers remain sealed under buildings we think we constructed. Their knowledge persists in fragments we are slowly rediscovering, calling it innovation when it is merely recovery. And their story, the true story of what happened in 1817, waits to be told by anyone brave enough to piece together the evidence that survived the erasure. They want us to believe it was always like this, that we built everything ourselves, that giants are fairy tales and advanced ancient civilizations are fantasies. But the photographs exist. The newspaper accounts exist. The bones exist, hidden but not destroyed. And the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it has been buried. The giants built bridges that still stand, cathedrals that still tower, structures that defy explanation and challenge everything we think we know. They were here. They were real. They were ended. And if we do not remember them, if we accept the lie that they never existed, then their destruction becomes complete. Their bloodline was ended in 1817, but their memory survives in stone and bone, in archives and photographs, in the impossible architecture that surrounds us. Silent witnesses to a catastrophe we are not supposed to remember. But they remember. And now perhaps so do you.